one of the most satisfying parts of the Book of Mormon. This is what historiography should be. It's full of drama, personality, of all sorts of things. So, it's the I think like the 24th chapter of, yes. We'd come to the 24th chapter and we'll say the 31st verse of Mosiah. Now remember how it had happened. Mosiah had left the Nephite community and gone out and ended up in Zarahemla, became king of Zarahemla, which was a Amulekite settlement. And then out of that came other settlements. Another one went out, Zenith went out. He got himself stuck in the midst of the Lamanites, but he flourished there, surrounded by Lamanites completely. And his son Noah was the corrupt one, and Noah was hard pressed, and he decided the whole nation should take out and flee. And they took to it, but when the enemy started to overcome them, he said to his men, he just said, I and the army will go on, forget the women and children. That was not a nice thing to do. So they did go on, and a lot of them started to regret it, and a lot of them refused to go, stayed back, and others started to drift back very soon. And he got very unpopular and got himself burned up. And then the priest continued on under the leadership of a man called Amulon. This Amulon is he's a VIP, a very important and a very ambitious person, as becomes clear here. They found the priests of King Noah in a place which they called Amulon. They named it after their leader, just like we call Brigham City. So he must have been an important person. He was their leader, Amulon, and he must have been important back there. We learn a little later on that he had been a rival, an old friend of Alma back in the priest quorum, and he hated his guts. So this tension between them is really something. The name of the leader of those priests was Amulon. We can look ahead to the 9th verse of the next chapter. Amulon knew Alma, that he'd been one of the king's priests. He was the priest too, you see, they'd both been in it. But he was an important guy, apparently. He was aspiring to be chief priest, and he is here. They named the settlement after him, and he is now leader of the priests. And he still aspires to leadership, and he achieves it. He gets a real break. He gets a sponsor, and is able to rule as people do who get sponsors, like Angelo and Measure for Measure. The name of his leader was Amulon. Amulon, now notice what he did. Remember, the reason the priests were being chased now is because they had captured the Lamanite girls. They were married with them. Notice what small potatoes this is. There were only 24 of them. They were married with them, and they went forth, and Amulon decided they should go forth and plead with the Lamanites. After all, we're fellow Lamanites, let's bygones be bygones, and so forth. And the Lamanites are always more compassionate than the Nephites, and so here, this is what happens. Amulon in the 33rd verse. He pleaded with the Lamanites, and he sent forth their wives, who were the daughters of the Lamanites, to plead with them, and that worked. The Lamanites had compassion, and so Amulon joined up with the Lamanites, and they were traveling, the Lamanites who ran along, in search of the land of Nephi, and they discovered this land of Helam. Now with Amulon has joined their company, they're moving on now, a mass of them, and they discover the land of Helam. Happy land, prosperous land called Prosper Phoenix, a good name. Helam means like Phoenix. It means reborn, prosperous, flourishing, all that sort of thing. So it was the name of good omen for a colony, and that's where Alma was now, and they came to Helam. And what happens? Amulon takes over everything and not only pushes Alma into the background, but he starts persecuting in grand style. Here, they discovered the land of Helam, and there was Alma and his brethren. And the Lamanites promised Alma that if they'd show them the way to the land of Nephi, Amulon putting them on to me, you can be sure of that, they would grant unto them their lives and their liberty. Alma agreed and showed them the way, and then they said, April Fool. They wouldn't keep their promise. I see the fine hand of Amulon there, don't you? But after Alma had shown, he refused to do it. So then, you notice how we have no race problem here. You can't talk about Nephites and Lamanites. Look how these things are mixed up now. Here's another mixing of Lamanites. Now a group in which the women are Lamanites and the men are Nephites, and that's a common phenomenon. You know, certainly as late as the 1940s, the women in the city of Seville, they still spoke Arabic. since 1492, there haven't been any Arabs in Spain, but the women all spoke Arabic, and the men, they didn't know it, but the women spoke Arabic and Spanish in the city of Seville in Spain. This happens, women have their own languages, and they do among the Hopis too. They have a special language just for the women, as far as that goes. I remember I just got laughed out of court because I once said thank you using the woman's language to some people, and oh boy, that was a real boo-boo. But anyway, notice how these things are all mixed up here. This is part, we mustn't be too simplistic about this Book of Mormon story. This is complicated enough. Well, then what's happened? They wouldn't keep their promise, but they went on. They're moving through, you see. The remainder of them went on to the land of Nephi. A part of them returned and went back to their wives and children. Tired of the expedition, I suppose. And the children of the guards who had been left in the land. The king of the Lamanites granted unto Amulon. Amulon said, we'll stay here. And he persuaded the king of the Lamanites to make him the local chief, to make him the king, to give him absolute power there. And we see now that the king of the Lamanites, he had a lot of territory, as the Indians always do. Still, I mean, the idea is that you have a great chief and chiefs under him. You have tribes, and then you have clans within the tribes. Every tribe has clans within it and so forth. And this is what they have. And of course in the East you have the same, especially among the Celts. You'll find it in Caesar's Gallic Wars. It's a beautiful example, is how Orgetorix is the great king, and Casticus and Dumorix are under him, and everybody's aspiring to be the great king. And there is the high king and the king that's under him. Anglo-Saxon England was divided up the same things into the Edwards and so forth. Harold was only the high king of a lot of others. And so he gets himself made king over the Nephites of Alma's community. The king of the Lamanites granted to Amulon the king to be a king and ruler over his people who were in the land of Helam. They took over and they joined up with Alma's people, and this puts Amulon in the driver's seat. And so in the 24th chapter now, came to pass, Amulon gained favor in the eyes of the king. You can be sure he would. The high king is only too glad to turn over to him the responsibility for judging. Well, remember, and by this assent has made thee Thane of Cawdor. Remember, hail Macbeth is Thane of Glamis, and then the king makes him Thane of Cawdor. Hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter. As he mounts up, his wife gets more and more excited. He gets higher and higher ranks. But these are petty kingships. The Macbeth is the king, and the Thane of Cawdor was a betrayer, so he lost his kingdom, and it was given to Macbeth, who was planning the big treason. And so these things go throughout your tribal histories. And Amulon gained favor with the king, and who, as I say, who is only grand. Now, most tyranny works through patronage. You'll see that. It's usually a patron, a well-meaning king that knows what's going on. Back home, we find this a little later on in the Book of Mormon. Classic example, of course, the classic example is that, as mentioned in Measure for Measure, where the Duke in Vienna, he makes Angelo, his secretary, he's going away and makes Angelo his Duke in his place. And Angelo really loads it on. And so when he plays his dirty tricks, he exercises his power and throws his weight around the most repulsive way, so that Isabella says, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, most assured him, most of that which he's most ignorant of what he's most assured. His angry image like his glassy image like oh boy, I'm awful. This is Monday morning, isn't it? Forget that. His glassy image like an angry ape plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven as make the angels weep. You give a man a little authority, and this is what happens. 121st section, isn't it? They'll do that. But he didn't have any authority himself. It was granted him by the Duke, you see. But the fact is the Duke was prowling around dressed up as a monk and seeing just how this man could manage. He was thinking of turning it over to him. It wouldn't do at all. This guy didn't know how to handle authority. This happens. Remember what the 121st section is the nature of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they think, begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. And so this is what happens with Amulon. He takes it out on Alma. And so, and of course in Matthew 25, the classic example is in 24th chapter of Matthew, 24th, 25th, they overlap, where the master of the house goes away, and remember he leaves the house in charge of his servant. the apostles are asking, how should we behave until you come again? He says, this is the way. You don't know when the Lord's coming again, but don't act like this man. As soon as he was put in charge of the house, he started lording it all over the other servants, oppressing them, roughing them, giving high commands, making everybody miserable. What will happen when the Lord comes home and discovers him doing that sort of thing, he says. So that's why he's going to come by surprise. That's why he's not going to announce his coming, because we'll all be dressed and polished and spit and ready for inspection when the general comes around, see. If we knew ahead of time, you don't get a good test that way. So the Lord comes like a thief in the night, catches everybody by surprise, and he catches the servants. What are these servants doing? Don't be found living riotous lives and expensive lives, he says, while you are oppressing other people. That's what the Lord doesn't want to find when he comes back. That's what he's going to find. And so we have, he was appointed, not only this, the Lamanites granted unto him that his and his brethren, that they should be appointed teachers over his people. Well, that was natural, but they were educated priests. And these kings were Lamanites, mixture of Lamanites, Nephites, Amalekites. And here was Amulon and his college of priests, Noah's council, the most learned men in the land. They're the ones to appoint teachers, so he naturally appoints them teachers. They took the job naturally. It's a part of empire. Even under the people who were in the land of Shemlon and the land of Shalom and the land of Amulon. It goes right back to the place where they had settled originally, and they connect the two lands. It must be close together. It's connected all up and now put under the rule of Amulon. The city called Amulon, city village. Well, you have a big village. They have 10,000, 15,000. That's a good size. And they have the Amulon lands, and they have the Shemlon lands, means the lands to the east, to the left side, and the Shalom lands means the higher lands, Shalom, high, safe, high, dry lands, and the land of Amulon too. Here's an ambitious man. We overlook Amulon among the characters, the dangerous characters in the Book of Mormon. We just passed by him, but he was as clever as any of them. For the Lamanites had taken possession of all these lands, therefore the king of the Lamanites had appointed kings over all these lands. That's the idea. Chiefs, he's the high king, and he appoints kings to take the load off his shoulders. The name of the king of the Lamanites was Laman, as is Noach. Just as you have a long string of Caesars, you're going to have a long string of Lamans here. And therefore he was called King Laman, and he was king over a numerous people. And he appointed teachers of the brethren of Amulon. I say they were the educated priestly class here. In every land that he possessed. So he sent them around circling, not just in Amulon territory, but throughout the whole Lamanite territory, which is an extensive and populous one. And thus, see, they're circulating, they're being the teachers, and thus the language of Nephi, notice this racial mixture again, the language of Nephi began to be taught among all the people of the Lamanites. We break up very soon into dialects and languages. As I say, you have 12 Hopi villages on 3 mesas, and each village has a different dialect. You can recognize, Hopi can recognize a person in which village, and they're all a few miles apart, you know, but each have, like the islands, like the Frisic Islands, the islands of Friesland, speak a language very close to Old English, very close. But they're all connected, of course, but any native can immediately spot what island you come from by the words you use, the dialect, and so forth. So they're different languages, and very soon they become so that you can't understand. 2 years ago, we were visited by some cousins from the Hebrides, from the islands on the west coast of Scotland there, out there. And they spoke perfectly good English. Perfectly good English. Everything was right. Used the same words we could. We took them around the valley and showed them all the sights. We couldn't understand a word they said. So they were speaking English, you see. So this can happen very soon. They'd only been on those islands. Well, the separation had been since the year 1621. 300 years, but 300. See, these people have been here more than 300 years. They've been here 500 years. So dialects are certainly formed everywhere. That's why, well, Kraber found 27 different Indian languages still surviving in California. 27 different languages. That doesn't mean there were 27 different migrations or anything like that. They just developed. It makes a problem for American Indians, as I say, unless you want to take the trouble to learn one, like the man on the first mesa who told me, when I asked him how many people spoke Tiwa, he says, lots of people speak Tiwa. 100 people speak Tiwa, he says. So there you are. And that's what you have here. So they learned the common language. It's like learning the lingua franca. They had all the Anglo-Saxon dialects. England was sanded with them. You see, Old English you study with Northumbrian, because Northumbrian is the oldest surviving documents and so forth, and then Beowulf, something quite different. And then you have Standard Saxon, West Saxon, used by King Alfred, in which a lot of literature survived and so forth. But then the Normans came over and imposed Norman French on the whole thing, and they took it up like, they drank it up like milk, you know, the Saxons, and they adopted all the usages of the Normans they needed, and grammar and everything, but they kept their own language. They mixed them together, and so we have the most flexible language in the world today in English. Also the biggest vocabulary. There are over 470,000 words in the Webster Dictionary. It's tremendous thing mixed together. Book of Mormon uses only 3,000 words. That's great. Shakespeare uses 34,000 words. For one writer, that's something. A lot of the words he's given are stuck with the language. So again, this language problem in the Book of Mormon, I'm afraid you need a Urim and Thummim if you're going to translate those plates by the time they've been here. And people say, oh, well, they're Reformed Egyptian, they're Hebrew, and so on. So they're all mixed together, just like our English. Every time you say a word like that, English, see, that's not from Anglia, that's from the coast of, that's from the north coast of Holland. And the Saxons, they're more central. They speak, we have both languages. Now we call it Anglo-Saxon, we hyphenate it. And so it goes and so it goes. So this language business, they began to have the people learn the language of Nephi. Taught to all the people of the Lamanites, they're going to have a lingua franca. And they use it for business, and of course they become very prosperous. This is a great tool, you see. We want to make English the one tool in the country because that will expedite business. That's why in the Middle Ages, of course, you used Latin until the great banking houses of Italy were established, and then Italian becomes the official language everywhere. But here it's Nephite. And it tells exactly what you'd expect. They kept them to keep their record that they might write to one another. What kind of writing did they have? I think they'd use something like moncas. The moncos of the Hopis are combinations of symbols, the symbols you recognize. There's no such thing as a picture language that you can read and look and tell what it is by pictures. You have something that looks like it, like Egyptian hieroglyphics, made up of pictures, but when two men start to read it, they won't come to the same conclusion at all. You have to be trained to recognize. Well, that means you have a written language. It doesn't have to be alphabetic, it can be syllabic, but it's not picture language. You don't show, he went into the house, you don't show a word for he, and you put an F, you put a snake instead of that. That's he, F, serpent. And he went into the house, you do put walking legs following the word, but E, you put the two feathers first. That's phonetic, you see. And then the two legs, and then you draw a picture of a house, but only after you put the letters PR, meaning house. See? He went into the house. So it's the same thing here. Indians do have a written language. Again, back to the Hopis, they've left their glyphs all over the Southwest, to showing the various passos, the various places they've been, various places. They're the same characteristic things. See, these monkers are signs of familiar signs used by various clans and so forth. So you can recognize clear up, well, up into central Utah and down into New Mexico, all the way down to Mexico. You can recognize the Monco, say, of the Beaver clan, or of the Reed clan, the Bear clan especially. That's the great wandering one. That's one of the more powerful ones. And the Parrot clan. The Parrot clan is the second most important, but in some cases they're the ruling clan. And why would they be parrots if they came from the deserts of southern Utah? Well, they weren't, of course. They migrated to there. But you get the characteristic. And then you have the flute man. Everywhere you go, you find an insect with two, as he was playing a double flute, and he has antennas. He walks along as if he had a big hump on his back. He was carrying a load, and he walks along. You'll find that all over the place. That represents we were wanderers here. We camped here. That's a wandering sign. Because you find these, what do they call these men? They're wandering all over the place, and you find them everywhere. Well, so they did have a conventional use of symbols, which is writing. That's all our writing is. Every letter we have is a letter. See, our A is just Aleph, a picture of an ox, his horns, of course, upside down, capital A. Aleph, which of course is Aleph, alphabet, that's the beginning of all. Beta is a picture of a house. It was written just square like that. Now we write it because to speed it up, you see. You don't want to draw an angular house each time. You just go bing, 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 and that's your house. So we're writing hieratic in English when you write. And delta, dardar, is a dardar bush. You don't want to draw a triangle every time, so you just go bing, bing, like that. You've got your three sides. And so it's the old conventional Semitic alphabet, Phoenician, but probably taken from the Egyptian, as we find in the Sinai Peninsula, where you find a transfer from Egyptian hieroglyphs to the Phoenicians. And that was the theory of Petrie and others, then you're right. So this is all perfectly credible, perfectly in order, that they had them learn the Nephite language, and they had them adopt writing as a means of expediting business. And of course that's what the, go down in Peru where they use the grass, they tie the grass knots, you know, they're very they're very efficient at communicating that way, a message in knots. There are various ways. You have the tally, and our ancestors used the tally stick. But see, these various ways of commuting, and they have them, just like the touch sticks and so forth, and a certain wand passed around. You know the herald always passes a wand. You always see Hermes with his caduceus, with his staff. That's the staff the herald makes. It has markings on it. It has his message. And so it goes, so it goes. So this way they were able, with these exchanges, to increase their riches. And they began to trade with one another. Now, how would Joseph Smith figure out this? It's a marvelous thing, the way this is constructed. With such tremendous economy, it's okay. He tells the whole story here. While he's telling this story of Amulon and Alma, he just throws this in without any extra charge. To increase in riches, they began to trade with one another and wax great and began to be cunning and a wise people. If you start trading, you do. As to the wisdom of the world, yea, and very cunning people, delighting in all manner of wickedness, that means exchanges and tricks, and plunder, except it were among their own brethren. No white-collar crime. That's very interesting. They wouldn't rob their own people. It's the same thing in Israel, you see. You can't charge interest. You can't enslave a person. That's wrong. If he's an Israelite. They have two rules going for dealing with Israel and dealing with the world. As we learned in the case of Shylock. If I could once but catch him in the hip, I'd feed him fat, the ancient grudge I bear him, he says. Well, so they're doing that, but they don't cheat their own. White-collar crime is by far the worst, see, because you're fooling and robbing people that trust you. And we're living in the capital of that. So we're going on. If any of you have been taken in, don't invest in anything in Utah. Delighting all manner of wickedness, except among their brethren. They have that honor among thieves. Now Amulon, he began to exercise authority, you can believe that, over Alma and his brethren, and began to persecute him. He'd had it in for Alma. Now, would he think Alma was a traitor because he walked out on the priestly he fled with the priest, but he took the families with him and he set out. He could have an argument that Alma was a traitor, but he was the worst traitor. He was the one that walked out on their wives and children. He not only deserted the king, he deserted everybody. Went out and took over himself with the priests, and then he stole the Lamanite girls and so forth. But who was guilty of doing the wrong thing? Alma kept the people together. He took them out. We know the reasons and so forth. But imagine what the rivalry would be between the two, how he would hate Alma, because he would think Alma was the great man. Alma was doing the right thing. This represents Rochefoucauld's famous maxim, nous pouvons pardonner ceux qui nous injurent. We can pardon those who damage us, who injure us, but we can never pardon those whom we injure. See, and he could never pardon. He had wronged, you see. He had wronged Alma, so he could never pardon Alma. That's right. And that's true. We can easily wrong those, we can easily forgive those who wronged us, but never those we have wronged. That rankles. You have to have a reason for it, and so you'll never forgive that guy if you've wronged him. So he began to persecute him. He got on his nerves and so forth. Notice this pecking order of the corporate ladder. He is middle management. See, the king puts him in, and he can do what he darn pleases. And Alma was the king. They'd chosen him as that king in their head, and now Amulon just pushes him out. He's going to take over now. So Amulon knew Alma, that he'd been one of the king's priests, and it was he that believed the words of Abinadi. He knew about that, you see. You started all this, he said. You can imagine Shakespeare at this point would have marvelous dialogue between them, like the king plays, where he has these long, long-running accusations back and forth. That in Greek drama is called a stichomachia, or a stichomachia, either one, where I say a verse, then you say a verse. Oh, kakneton, sidro braton, tidesoy braton, sidome braton. So you go blah, 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 blah. One person recites a line, the other tops it with another line. This goes on for half an hour as the two heroes or villains shout at each other in a stichomachia. And we have this situation here. It'll be very well dramatized. And so this is what happened. He was wroth with him. Notice, he knew that he was one of the king's priests. He that had believed the words of Abinadi was driven out before the king. Therefore, he was wroth with him. He was mad with him for that reason, you see. For he was subject to King Laman, and yet he exercised authority over them, and he put tasks upon them and put taskmasters over them. He is really rubbing it in. He is the unjust steward. And this again, the Nephite characteristic, which is it's their meanness when they have the upper hand, the insolence of apartheid and so forth. Amulon commanded them that they should stop their cries if they complained. And he put guards over them to watch them, that who should ever be found calling on God should be put to death. Well, how low can you go? You see, he's a priest himself, you see. But anyone calling upon God he would put to death, because this is the people he didn't like. And all this because of his personal enmity with with Alma. So they prayed in their hearts. How can you pray in your thoughts? Notice the Lord, you don't pray out loud. Remember, the standard prayer is, Lord, hear the words of my mouth. You were required to pray vocally. Though Joseph Smith, until he went to the grove, he said he was raised in a religious family, but nobody ever prayed out loud. That time, that was a new thing. Alma and his people didn't raise their voice to the Lord, but poured it out their hearts to him, and he did know the thoughts of their hearts. Well, the most powerful force in the world is the strongest, is that of faith, and is thought, of course. The most powerful form of thought is faith. And they could count on this. Suddenly they were feeling assured, reassured. It was a perfect setup for revenge, but they have no thought of revenge at all here. And they began to be comforted. For I know of the covenant which ye have made unto me, the Lord tells them through Alma. I will ease your burdens which they put upon your shoulders, that you cannot feel them on your backs. We're going to be disappointed. We don't find the revenge scenario here. After all this villainy of Alma, we're not going to have the mandatory final super explosion at the end of the film when everything has to be blown up. No, the vengeance never takes place. I'm afraid we must be disappointed. Because the theme of all our John Wayne epics and so forth is the guy is shown as being very bad at the beginning, so you'll really see that what he gets is he deserves, and we all wait to see him get it. We wait here in vain. And came to pass that the burdens put, the 15th verse, the burdens which were laid upon Alma and his brethren were made light. Yea, the Lord did strengthen them, that they could bear up their burdens with ease, and did submit cheerfully and with patience. Now that was the pioneers. Less aggressive people could not be imagined. In every case when there was a showdown, when they had a great possibility of overhand, well, there were some hotheads and so forth, but it was remarkable how they avoided. And after they left, you see, then the mobs broke loose and started destroying each other. The bushwhackers and the jayhawkers and so forth, the bloody Kansas, the burning of Lawrence and the like, and these terrible mobs that would circulate, destroy. The thing became a riot of mobs after they left. It wasn't just the Mormons that took it. They took it and left. And the others, terrible things began to happen. The bloody shirt and all this. And the Lord said to him, what are we going to do about it? We're going to get out. On the morrow, I'll deliver you out of bondage. Remember, we've had Rechabites before. This is the way you do. And I think you could list at least 20 examples in which large factions or tribes, like or clans, like, which was it? What clan? Oh, yes. Tibequepta is he Bear Clan? Yes. But anyway, they had a tug of war, and they decided that the clan that lost the tug of war would have to move, and the whole thing moved out, and they went to Moinkopi and joined another village, another society, and this is the way they do. They've done it time and again. If there was too much tension among two groups, they would sometimes they would cast lots, and they decide which should go, and that's out of ancient history. That's a common theme too, that you decide to migrate, as the Phoenicians did under Dido and her sister Melissa. They left and founded Carthage, and so. He came to Alma, he said to Alma, the Lord says to Alma, thou shalt go before this people, I will go before thee, and deliver this people out of bondage. And it came to pass that Alma and the people in the nighttime gathered their flocks together, and also their grain. We notice the same thing has happened back here, 22:2. This is worth looking at. Oops. And yes, we're talking about here the Ammon and Limhi, and there was no way they could deliver themselves out of bondage except it were to take the women and children and their flocks and herds and their tents and depart into the wilderness. That's Mosiah 22:2. So close together these two migrations come, but this is the way things were being done. That's what we're getting to in a time of tension like this. We talk of a swarming time, the great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries. You see, the barbarians, when our ancestors overran Europe, that was called the swarming time. The Völkerwanderung, the Germans call it, when the people were wandering and mixing up and settling down. The most amazing thing is how people from the Far East, way up there almost to Alaska in Asia, ended up in Portugal, of all places. Portuguese. Those Goths there. Well, anyway, they decided the same thing happens here. And all night long they were gathering their flocks together and getting ready. Oh, darn, I was going to bring Merriam's book along. He gave a very interesting reports. He got all the British reports on the Battle of the Bulge and so forth, and how completely fooled they were, how they could set in motion and organize, I say, just a few miles from our front, an army of 200,000 men. And with this enormous intelligence operation we had, 100% fooled, completely fooled. Our generals were. Little me, I wasn't fooled, but it didn't do any good. Nobody listens to me, because I was keeping the situation map in the closest contact with them. We'd send out scouts and patrol. They'd say, well, they're gathering up, they're building up then. The 6th Armor, Panzer, Fallschirmjäger, they're coming down this road, they're building up here and there and there, and it just went back. They didn't like to hear it in London, so, or in Brussels, so nothing came of it. Until Rundstedt overran everything. I mean, they just came all of a sudden, and then it was wild. And so this is what happens here. They're in the nighttime, they build up. Remember, we mentioned before, these people have been watching. They used the wine trick the other time. They didn't this time. It was the Lord. They didn't need the wine, because it was the Lord that caused a deep sleep to come upon the Lamanites. A profound sleep, and so they snuck out. And they came to a valley which they called the Valley of Alma, just as I say, we have Brigham City and so forth, and Smithfield, and the little tiny infinitesimal town of Nibley up in Cache Valley. You see, they named them after people that sell them. The Valley Alma, because they led their way in the wilderness, they called it after Alma. Yea, and the Valley of Alma, they poured out their thanks to God. Now, they sigh of relief and settle down. Don't fool yourself, you see. You're still in danger. Get moving, the Lord says. You're not safe yet just because I've performed one miracle. Go on. The Lord said to Alma, haste thee and get thou and this people out of this land, for the Lamanites have awakened and do pursue thee. Therefore get thee out of the land. I will stop the Lamanites. Don't worry. We think of Nephi's prayer, remember, when he says, Lord, block up the way of my enemies pursuing me. Don't block up my way. Make the way open for me, the level way. He's talking about fleeing through the desert. He says, but block up the way of my enemies. Place stumbling blocks before them. They won't pursue me. The same thing here. The Lord does that. And I'll stop the Lamanites. And so, after they'd been in the wilderness 12 days, you know the story, I think we've all heard it, a story about in Colonia Juarez, down in North Mexico, with the Romneys lived down there in those days, and Pancho Villa came through with a big crowd. They were burning and looting and all this sort of thing, and they were held up. They saw very clearly coming a lighted train. There was no train there. They all saw the lighted train. They took out. They thought troops were coming or something, and they took out and they left the town alone. I've heard that story many times. See, the Lord blocks people in various ways. He did it here, you see. And so, after they've been in the wilderness 12 days, again, that gives us geographical tips, since there's such a gang of them moving. And they stopped a while. In fact, they stopped too long. They were nearly caught up with them. They got away, and they arrived at the land of Zarahemla. These places are fairly close together, but they're in the safe home now in Zarahemla. And King Mosiah received them with joy, and they celebrate that, of course. This is what happens. So when people come together, these great gatherings, this is one thing. You know, we have the descriptions. That's a marvelous painting by Bierstadt and others of the Indian life in the West here. They used to meet up at Jackson's Hole, for example. And you know, down Springville, you go to Kelly's Grove at Springville. That was a place where the Indians would come by thousands. They'd meet in the fall. But Kelly's Grove is a beautiful place. And what's the matter with you? Oh, I'm doing something wrong. I'm not taking the clue. Well, anyway, little gesture. They're these places where the Indians meet, and in great numbers. They come from great distances. You know, the trappers would do the same thing, because they'd come there to trade the furs and so forth. They're these places where they'd have congregations once a year, sometimes once every 4 years, and they were huge affairs, you see. Well, like corroborees, like powwows and so forth. And this is what it was. He called all the people to gather together. Well, this is ancient too, of course. I wrote an article on that too a long time ago called The Heliocentric State, when they did that thing in the ancient world. I didn't have the Book of Mormon at all in those days in mind, not at all, but it's all down here. And here they all come together. So this gives us a survey and a census. It doesn't give us numbers, but it says the people of Nephi, descendants of Nephi, and the people of Zarahemla, descendants of Mulek. And the Mulekites were far more numerous than the Nephites. But the Nephites and the Mulekites together weren't even half as numerous as the Lamanites. So they'd increase much more rapidly. It breaks them down into tribes. This should have been in a 3-in-1. Anyone have a 3-in-1 here? Anyone have a 3-in-1? No. Yes? No? All right, let me show you here. Right in the third section of Doctrine and Covenants here. On the 116 pages that were lost, there was information that we don't have today, and this is a broad hint of the sort of thing that was on that, where it tells us right in the third section, which is discussing the loss of those 116 pages, which are not going to be replaced at that time. And it says here, oops, oh, I lost your place. Well, you can find it again. It's a very interesting thing here. Here it is. In the 16th verse, the 3rd chapter, nevertheless, my work shall go forth, inasmuch as the knowledge of a Savior shall come unto the world through the testimony of the Jews, even they shall know that the Savior shall come by my people. And this message will go to the Nephites. There's still Nephites around. And the Jacobites. It breaks them down into 7 tribes. And the Josephites. They're still distinct. And the Zoramites. Now, they're the 4 tribes that follow the Nephite, are classed as Nephite. And it tells us later that's just purely a cultural, political classification, called them Nephites, because they include these 4 tribes: Nephites, Josephites, Zoramites, and Jacobites. And the others, Lamanites, Lemuelites, and Ishmaelites. Those are the other 3. There are 3 tribes, and that makes the 7 tribes. You usually have to have 7 tribes. That's 7 or 12 you have to have. But this, again, I say it's more complicated than you think. And the Lamanites, even though they had only 3 tribes, are far more numerous. It's an interesting development. Well, because they have a healthier family life. He tells us that they love their children and so forth, and they don't play around like Amulon, people like that. Now all the people of Nephi were assembled together, and also all the people of Zarahemla. See, it was a great assembly is what it was. It must have been an impressive gathering. And they were gathered together in 2 bodies. That's natural, of course. There's entirely... Well, we have the same thing by the Bible. I'd read Deuteronomy 31 and Exodus 24 when the same thing happens in Israel. And they unite in separate bodies. You keep a certain identities. It says there, these tribes are still aware of their identity because genealogy is important as far as that goes. And Mosiah read, and what they do, they have the law read to them, and that's what they must do. Up in the north, if you go to Iceland, you will still find the Thingstetter, the place where they used to hold the ancient things. As you may know, Spanish Fork, excuse me, is the oldest Icelandic settlement in the Western Hemisphere. When I first came to Provo, there were 5 wards in Spanish Fork where they still spoke Icelandic. Well, anyway, and I gathered a good Icelandic library there. But you will find throughout Iceland, certain places, the Thingstetter, the places where the things met. The thing was the great meeting of the people. They met in a ring, in a circle, and you'll find the booth the rocks, the boulders around where they set up their booths. Booths of branches, green trees, rocks, blankets, anything they could throw together, exactly like the Sukkah of Israel or the Sukkah of Egypt. And it always met at the Logberg. There was always a place called the Logberg, the place of the law, the Mount of the Law, the Logberg. And the Gothi, which is our word God, he was the high priest. He would stand on the Logberg and read the law to the people. Those people, remember, had writing very early. Remember, the only people in the world with a complete history are the Icelanders. They have a complete history of every family that ever went there, because everything was recorded. Well, anyway, the point is, you see, he goes up on the Logberg and he reads them the law. The same thing happens in Israel, the same thing happens in Rome, the same thing happens in Greece and so forth. When the law is pronounced, it is sent down from the mountain. It's read to the people as Moses read it to them. He brings it down, he reads it, and the people are camped at the foot of the mountain and living in booths, and it's called the Festival of the Booths, the gathering. See, these customs you'll find throughout the world, and it's a very surprising thing. You see, it's not the sort of thing you would invent spontaneously. It went back to a single source. So they met here, and I say it was very impressive too, in the 2 bodies, and he read them the records of Zenos, and he read the account of Alma, and this gave them a new perspective entirely. The reading in is filling them up on both the history and the important events. We must be informed, and this was something new to them. Notice it says in the 8th verse, they knew not what to think. I never knew such things were going on. I'm going to have to cancel my recital tonight. I can see this. I'm not in good voice. Yes?
I suppose they were so struck with amazement when they read these records.
Well, look, this is telling us what's been going on at Zarahemla, what's been going on, well, this is back again in Zarahemla, what's been going on with these people who have been going out everywhere. He's talking about 3 or 4 different colonies, 3 or 4 different people and migrations, where they originated, where they begin, their tribulations and so forth. And they didn't know any of this had been going on with their relatives or anything else. Is this what's happened since we left Jerusalem? Well, they're struck with amazement, actually, but it says they didn't know what to think. They behold those things that filled them with exceeding great joy. You see, this is the, again, they were glad to hear this. You have to have the law, you have to have the book of the law read, that is the point. And you have to have, by acclamation, you have to approve it. You have to, well, the classic example here is the King Benjamin with the new coronation, the new year. The people come, they bring their first fruits, they camp in booths. The king gives them a speech from the tower, exactly as happens in Nathan the Babylonian, who records that thing happening with the Jews in ancient times. There's nothing in the Bible about that, but it's in the Book of Mormon. It's in Jewish records. That's the way they used to do when they gathered all together. Well, and notice they were filled with both joy and sorrow. These people are easily moved, and they are. They sit around and weep their heads off at conferences and so forth. It's a very cheerful event when you go to a conference with the Indians. And even shed many tears of sorrow. This is the warp in the roof, you see. This is our life. The old man at the gate, we're told in heaven, many accounts of this, that how in heaven when you go there, there is a gate, 2 gates, and one where the righteous go through and one where the wicked go through, and there's an old man sits there, and it's Enoch with a record, with a book. And he records, and he weeps, and he smiles. He smiles and is happy every time a righteous person comes, and he weeps every time a wicked one does. And we find the same thing in the Book of Mormon a little later on in Alma when he talks about the title of liberty. It's another story. We'll never get to it if we don't get along here. But no, this is all relevant. You see, my gosh, it's all here. How did this ever get in the Book of Mormon? By some kid trying to fool the family, as Mrs. Brody said. And then again, when they thought upon the Nephites, their brethren, they were full of pain and anguish. Again, you see, from Greenland's icy mountains, I don't know what the English of that is, but can we suffer that they go in ignorance. The thought of the pagans in ignorance breaks the heart of Christians, supposedly, so they send missionaries out. But they were, and this is a very interesting note. Now, the children of Amulon, the children of Amulon, he had children, the priest had children with these Lamanite girls. Their mothers, became their mothers. And his brethren, and of course the Lamanite girls were still Lamanites, and they had raised their children, because the children always stay until the initiation, have regular initiations into puberty. Until then, the children always stay with their mothers and are raised by their mothers. Well, these kids were all raised by Lamanite mothers, and so they were displeased with the conduct of their fathers. Their mothers were much more moral than their fathers were, and probably they didn't treat their fathers didn't treat their mothers very well. And so they wanted to be Nephites, and they took upon themselves the name of Nephi. No desire to dominate here at all, you see. They took upon themselves the name of Nephi, and they're joined with it. Here's more of your racial complications. You see, this is not a simple ethnic story at all. These people want to be called Nephites now. The kids wanted to be called Nephites, and they might be called the children of Nephi and be numbered among the Nephites, so they want to join the Nephites. And again, this is a thing that happens. And all the people of Zarahemla were numbered with the Nephites now, so we don't call them Mulekites anymore. They're Nephites too, everybody is. They're numbered with them, that's the name. And were conferred upon none but those who, and because for this cause the kingdom, but the kingdom went only, see, it's a political designation beginning with Mosiah, because the people were, only Nephites could rule. Now Nephi desired that Alma should take charge of the church. And now we come to the most interesting parts of what happens, how to manage the church here. Very important. This comes a little later. Yes, it comes very soon now. Yep. And Alma, this is the way he did it. Now remember, we have this, they're back in Zarahemla now, they're not back with that other crowd. And the king says, I'll put you in charge of the whole thing. And you can go around and establish the church. And Alma, remember, they come in with Ammon. And they went from body to body. Ammon was a Mulekite. They went from body to body, one body to another, preaching unto the people repentance and faith on the Lord. And he exhorted the people of Limhi and his brethren, all those that had been delivered, that they all know what it means. It came to pass that after Alma had taught the people many things, then he made an end of speaking, this is still at the meeting, that the king Limhi was desirous that he might be baptized. See, Alma is the one who brings the authority. And remember, Ammon refused to do it until he Alma showed up. All these people were desired they might be baptized. The same thing that happens in the case of Benjamin, when they all accept the covenant and cry out in a single voice that they accepted it. When the king asks them, do they accept it? They accept the covenant, and they're being baptized to show that they accept the covenant. Yea, Alma did baptize them after the manner in the waters of Mormon, using the same method, and they did belong to the church of God because of their belief on Alma. It's very much like the Dead Sea Scrolls here. And Mosiah granted to Alma, now not just church, he established churches everywhere. Remember, this is a large expanse here, a large empire. There are many towns and cities here. And he granted Alma that he might establish churches everywhere throughout the land of Zarahemla, and gave him power to ordain priests wherever he wanted to. It's going to become a sacral state, in other words. The priesthood is approved by the king, and this was done because there were so many people they couldn't be governed all one teacher, neither could they all hear in one assembly. So we had different assemblies and different churches everywhere. They wouldn't all have to come together in one group. They couldn't. It had to come too far. Therefore, they assembled themselves together in different bodies, and they were called churches, and they were ruled by Alma. What do we have here? And they were to preach nothing in the churches except repentance and faith in God. There were 7 churches. See, we just said there were the 7 tribes here. Remember, John writes in Revelations, he writes to the 7 churches in Asia. That's an coincidence, probably. But there were 7 churches, which certainly suggests 7 tribes, 7 groups here we have it. And they were called the people of God. They were given a name. Remember, Benjamin said, I'm going to give you a name today. When he talked to the people in their general assembly, I'm going to give you a name, he says, what their name should be. And the Lord did pour out his people upon them, and they were blessed and prospered in the land. Now the next chapter is devoted to the chapter on the church. This is another very important thing. What about the church? What authority does the church have over people? What authority has the church got over individuals if they don't want to belong to it, if they want to follow, if they want to leave in a group, or if they want to join a group? What do we do in that case? These are the rules that are to be laid down here, and both the king and Alma are completely stumped. They don't know what to do. They call upon the Lord and get instructions. So it came to pass, but this is the reason this becomes troublesome. Can the church force people to stay in it? It came to pass there were many of the rising generation who could not understand the words of King Benjamin. And it tells us why they didn't understand them. Being little children at the time, he spoke to the people, so they weren't there for Benjamin at all. Benjamin is basic. Well, do we understand Benjamin's teaching? Do we follow it? It's addressed to us, actually. They didn't follow it. They gave it up. They didn't understand it. They didn't believe, because they didn't believe on the 2 main points. There are 2 standard texts of whether a person is a real believer or not in the ancient records. Something like the recently discovered Bodmer papyrus. There were various sects broke off from the church in the 1st century and the 2nd century, especially the 2nd century, the Great Age of Heresy. 80 different Gnostic and other sects are listed by Epiphanius there, and he tells what they believe and so forth. All these sects broke off from the church, and what are the tests whether they're real Christian or not? Well, this is a letter discovered about 1950 in which Paul, about then, in which Paul is writing third letter to the Corinthians. He says, how can you tell? The first thing is they will deny the literal resurrection. The second thing, they will deny the literal returning of the Lord, the coming of Christ. And that's exactly what these people believe. Notice, these are the 2 things they can't believe. They'll believe in the morals, they'll believe in the word of wisdom, all the rest if you want it, but they won't believe in the literal resurrection. When people die, they die dead. After all, neither did they believe concerning the coming of Christ. He won't come again. And this is why they didn't believe, you see. It's a vicious circle. Because of their unbelief, they couldn't understand it. And because they couldn't understand it, they wouldn't believe it. Because they wouldn't believe it, their hearts were hardened. And they started to campaign against it. This always happens when people turn away from the church. That's the way. Because of their, notice this 3rd verse. This is the process, the anatomy of apostasy. In the 4th verse, it goes on with it. They were a separate people as to their faith and remained so ever after. This is going to lead very soon to the establishment of the religion of the Nephors, which dominates throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon. The religion that call themselves Christians is not the dominant religion among the Nephites, the Lamanites. It's the Nehors. They outnumber them far, far, and they persecute them and everything else. But throughout the Book of Mormon, Nehors, but we haven't got to him yet. Let's see, I see the time is up now. So I'll go home and gargle. There were separate people as to their faith and remained ever after, even in a carnal and sinful state. They wanted it that way. So we'll see now what happens. How do you deal with these people? This is if you are the king and you are the high priest and you have a state religion here, and you've authorized, the king recognized the priesthood, what are you going to do with these people that don't want to cooperate, won't believe any of that stuff? That's what he talks about. Very interesting chapter.